Hello, and welcome back to Baby Elias's stories. We now return to Blade Runner 3, Replicant Night, by K.W. Jeter. Chapter 17. He took the gun with him, even though he knew that Marley had fired off every round that had been loaded inside it. The weapon might still come in handy, despite feeling so much lighter. "You back here?" The man on the other side of the counter sneered at Deckard. "I thought you didn't care for our services. Figured we'd pretty much lost you as a customer." Deckard didn't feel like getting into another argument with the man. The last one, when he brought the skiff back to the rental yard upon his return from the outer Hollywood station, had been pointless enough. He dug into his pocket and brought out all the cash he had, a hot, sweaty clump of scrip, and dumped it on the counter. "Just give me the same one I had before," he said, "if it's fueled up and ready to go." Leaning his weight against the counter's front, Deckard didn't bother watching as the other man sorted through the bills. He felt tired and bruised. The physical aftermath of the attack on the bar where he'd been sitting and listening to the late Marley. The front of his jacket was still spotted with Marley's blood, memorial evidence of the assault rifle bullets that had poured into the booth. "I got off light," thought Deckard, as he looked down at himself. His jaw ached from the rifle butt blow he'd taken from the UN stormtrooper when he'd come to on the floor of the bar. It had taken a few minutes for a spell of blurred double vision to clear, at least enough for him to stumble out onto the immigrant colony streets. "You're short," announced the man behind the rental yard's counter. He stirred the bills about with his greasy forefinger. "There's not enough here for the deposit." Deckard brought himself up from his bleak thoughts and leveled his gaze at the man. "Then I'll take it on credit." The man's laughed bark out. "Ha! We don't do that." Warily, Deckard sighed and reached inside his jacket. "Yes, you do." He placed the cold muzzle end of the gun against the man's forehead. A few minutes later, as the skiff was passing through the orbits of Phobos and Deimos, the rental yard man had told him to just keep the little craft, not to even bother returning. Deckard pressed his aching back into the cockpit seat and assessed his situation. "There's a limit to what you can do with an empty gun," he told himself, especially since, where he was going, they would likely know that it was empty, that he was essentially unarmed. In some ways, it didn't even matter. He wasn't sure why he was going at all. Just to get killed? That was the likeliest answer to come to him. Could there be a better reason? Before he had lost consciousness, lying on the floor of the bar, Deckard had caught a glimpse of the figure standing in the doorway past the UN stormtroopers, taking care of business. Even without that sighting, he would have known that Sarah Tyrell was the prime motivator of all that happened. A dramatic touch, typical of her. She might have arranged for the lighting to be as perfect as that, spilling past her into the bar's darkness, silhouetting her like some shadowed angel, merciless and unavoidable. One other glimpse, sighted as he had rolled onto his back, the last of his awareness pouring out through the hole that the rifle butt blow had knocked in his world. He had even reached up, a futile hand, swamped by the black wave engulfing him, reached up to stop the men pulling the Rachel child out of the booth, taking her away. That was all he had seen. The memory of it rushed through his aching skull as soon as he had been able to lift his head from the bar's floor. Deckard had brushed bits of glass from his face as he worked himself into a sitting position and looked around the empty space. He'd been alone, patrons and bartender having wisely fled. The presence of the dead had been with him, both and Marley's corpse, slumped across the blood-mired table, and the briefcase, torn to mute fragments. Deckard had prodded the largest remaining piece, a corner with one lid hinge still attached, and had gotten no response. Whatever part of Roy Batty, the human original, had been embedded in the briefcase was gone now, dispersed to atoms as cold and fine as the white powder scattered irretrievably from the empty Sebastian packet. The walls of the bar had seemed to recede as Deckard had dropped the dead rubbish from his hands, as though the dimly lit space had grown as hollow as the one inside his chest. Before he had gotten to his feet, balancing himself with one hand against the booth's table, he had found one other thing in the wreckage, obviously left for him, placed right at his fingertips. Deckard had reached down and picked up the white rectangle of a business card, flipping it over to see the words Speed Death Productions and Urbenton's name below that. "I'm doing just what they want me to," thought Deckard as he gazed out the skiff's cockpit at the stars wheeling by. The gears meshing around him were pushed by both the living and the dead, with no great distinction made between those categories. Even the dead Marley had conspired, in his way, to limit all possibilities for action to one inevitable line. Quick thinking on Marley's part, when the UN stormtroopers had burst into the bar, he had used the gun to eliminate the briefcase itself, and thus any chance of Deckard's accomplishing the job he'd accepted. There'd be no carrying of Batty and whatever other information had been encoded into the box. Isidore's list of disguised replicants or mimetic bomb, no telling now, to the insurgents in the outer colonies. Before he died, Marley might have had the comfort of knowing that his own job, the one of stopping Deckard's delivery of the briefcase, had been pulled off, which left the teeth of the other gears, Sarah Tyrell and Urbenton, and the forces aligned with them, had correctly read Deckard's mind, had predicted what he would do when he resigned consciousness, and found both the Rachel child missing and the simple card indicating where she had gone. Urbenton's card, the only address on it, was a contact point in care of the studios at the outer Hollywood station. That was Urbenton's world, the one in which he comfortably operated. That was the destination to which Deckard had programmed the skiff, as inevitably as the tape unrolling on some distant video monitor. They knew he would come there, gun loaded or not, whether his chances of survival were at 0 or any point above. Not just for the little girl, the child named Rachel, but for Sarah as well. Wherever she went, he would have to go there, inevitably. Her destiny had become so intertwined with his that there was no escaping. "I should have killed her when I had the chance." Deckard gazed out of the cockpit without even seeing the stars. Too late for regrets now. He had waited too long. His hands stayed by memory of another woman's face, the one he had loved, identical in every aspect to Sarah. The great plan that he'd had, that he'd conceive all the way back on Earth so long ago had been the excuse for not putting the muzzle of a gun against her temple and pulling the trigger. Deckard knew that now. I should have killed her, but I couldn't have. Things had changed, though. He wondered if they had changed enough. Maybe he could do it now, despite her mirror resemblance to the dead Rachel. If I have to, he decided at last. If that was what Sarah was counting on, his inability to kill anything that looked so much like the woman who had slept in a glass-lidded coffin, and who now slept and woke only in the sealed chambers of his remembering. Then she might have a surprise coming to her. They all might. In his hand, when he'd come to, he had the last thing that Marley had given him, the ancient photo that had been hidden inside the lid of the Salander 3 first aid kit. The photograph was now safely tucked inside his jacket, and in another compartment of his memory were Marley's words, explaining what the photograph showed, what the image meant. Everything. As much as the others knew, the strings that Sarah and Benton and the ones behind them could pull, there were still some things that they didn't know, and that he did. Deckard laid his fingertips against the lapel of his jacket, feeling underneath the thin, still substance of the photo, warmed by his skin and pulse. He figured the time was coming, and soon enough, at the front of the cockpit, the miniature lunar sphere of the outer Hollywood station was rapidly approaching. A ripple passed across the stars as the skiff's drive units modulated down into uncompressed space. The hissing of snakes was merely the station's docking gates sealing behind the skiff, followed by the cockpit unlatching. Deckard emerged from the craft into near total darkness. A few LEDs glimmered on the control panel mounted on a nearby bulkhead, and the skiff's own running lights sent his blue-edged shadow merging with the empty space. His footsteps rang against the metal flooring as he headed toward a faintly recalled passageway. No point in trying to conceal his presence or his movement toward the station's center. They knew he was here. Or not, depending upon whether anyone else was. The last time he'd been at Outer Hollywood, the girdered substructure had vibrated with the activity going on in the various sound stages and studios. The recirculated air had carried the subliminal molecules of the Tex's and extras' sweat and exhaled breath. This time, as soon as Deckard had stepped down from the skiff, he'd perceived the station as empty and dead, as though abandoned by all the human and close to human forms that had been here before. He resisted the urge to call out, to attempt provoking a response. No need. Reaching the limits of the station's landing dock, he laid his hand on the rim of the barely perceived doorway. The pseudo-life creaked into action. A beam of light flared on and swung toward him, striking him full in the face. Even as Deckard winced and shielded his eyes, another section of machinery stirred at his presence. He saw the glistening eye of a camera lens, suspended a few meters above, as it tracked and focused upon him. The device's aperture irised farther open, then narrowed, as though the overlapping blades were biting down upon his curved reflection. A few more lights came on ahead of him, not enough to dispel the darkness, but sufficient to divide it into crescent shadows and blind corners. And the metal struts above, cameras flexed and shifted like roosting birds. Control cables and video mixed down feeds looped like the tendrils of a black neoprene jungle. All the blank, glassy optics turned toward him, some drawing back for wide-angle shots, others zooming in close upon his face. In the closest ones, Deckard could see himself, his own eyes turned into yet smaller mirrors in which the station's tracking network could be discerned. Nothing human behind the lenses. He could sense that they were on automatic, programmed to find and lock upon him, recording every step he took. With idiot concentration, they performed their appointed task, their wide, obsessive eyes staring at Deckard in perfect, rapt silence. As he stepped onto the outskirts of the fall LA sets, picking his way over the tangles of cables and massive banyan-like tripod legs, a rumbling sound came from the unlit reaches above his head. He looked up and saw neither stars nor clouds. The video camera swiveled beneath, an interlinked net of white PVC piping. The first drops of water struck Deckard's brow. Within seconds, a monsoon torrent swept over him and along the empty, simulated street, as the rainstorm from the metal disperser heads were whipping horizontal by the silvery rotating blades stationed around the set's edge. "That's good!" He couldn't keep himself from shouting, from tilting his head back so that the artificial rain, warm as his own blood, as though it had rolled all the way across deserts to the east, trickled under his collar and down his chest. "That's really good! I like that!" Deckard's voice boomed against unseen walls, beyond the false-fronted buildings next to him. The rain plastered his hair against his brow, pooled in the palms of his hands, dripped from the hem of his jacket. The wet skin of pavement shivered around him as the neon tubing at the corners and above the vacant shops' doorways sparked and flickered into blue and red life. One more switch had been thrown, a circuit completed, somewhere in this world's artificial heavens. "Bring it on!" As though in reply, the wind edged up to storm level, the puddled water at his feet driven into a sea of miniature waves before it was sucked away by the plumbing system hidden in the gutters. Deckard came close to being knocked off his balance, staying upright only by grabbing a lamppost wrapped with sudden kanji posters. The paper's heavy ink smeared across his hands and the point of his shoulder. Above his head, a dragon's red tongue flickered, the serpentine grace of its illuminated coils, an icy electric blue. "She's here," thought Deckard. He scanned across the drenched cityscape to the enclosing reality of cameras and shuttered lights beyond. Everyone else, Benton and his crew, might have left outer Hollywood, but Sarah Tyrell was still here. Deckard felt sure of her presence, as though some part of her had seeped into the fabric of the irreal Los Angeles. The lenses that watched him might as well have been her eyes, the steaming rain, the fury of her kiss. He had wanted to confront her. He had been fated to, and now found himself embraced by her in a zone of no escaping. The rain slackened a bit. It could almost have been an invitation to him. Deckard pushed himself away from the lamppost and walked, with the false storm in his face, deeper into the city's artificial heart. "Wake up! Time to die!" He heard the voice before he saw the figures before him. 2 men, or what could have been men. Deckard saw one of them only from the back, as the long-coated figure was lifted nearly off its feet by the other's fist, bunched at the throat. Deckard recognized one of the Kowalski replicants, but couldn't tell which it was, or what segment of repeated time he had stumbled into. "Then that must be me," thought Deckard. His gaze shifted to the one the replicant's fierce smile burned toward. A burst of visual static rolled across the images. Deckard reached out his hand. His palm and fingertips touched the smooth, cold glass of a high-res view screen. Billboard size, taller than himself. The Kowalski and Deckard inside the screen's illusion of depth were as big as in life, as in the reality on the other side. One world enfolded the other, each equally false. Deckard looked away from the image before him and saw the walls of the same alley, the high metal flank of the autonomic trash collection vehicle against which he had been trapped by the first Kowalski, the one back in the real LA, on Earth. All the details that had been recreated on the outer Hollywood set. He looked back again at the giant view screen and saw, only slightly blurred by the magnified pixel lines, the same alley's confines, like a photocopy one generation further on. The camera angle shifted, cutting to one directly over the Kowalski replicant's shoulder. Deckard saw his own face, struggling for breath against the massive knot of the white-knuckled fist under his chin. They dubbed it in, he realized. The video unreeling on the screen was what Urbenton had originally intended. The computer-generated simulation of Deckard's face over that of the actor playing him. "Time to die!" Kowalski's line, the echo from real time and Deckard's memory, had already been spoken. On the other side of the view screen, he watched as the replicant's blunt fingers rose toward his double's eye sockets. He braced himself for the sound of the gunshot, the bullet that would shatter Kowalski's forehead from behind, dropping the dead replicant to the ground. There was no shot. No gun roared from the mouth of that other alley, the one inside the view screen's doubly false world. The scene played on to the end that left its Deckard a bloody-faced corpse sprawled at Kowalski's feet. From outside that world, Deckard had watched his own death with a mixture of fear and awe. For a moment, he wondered which side of the view screen was real, whether the dead thing with his face was the one who'd lived and died in LA, and the one watching was its substanceless ghost. He looked down at his own hands, almost expecting to see the alley's rubbish-strewn ground through them, as though they were made of mist and rain. He heard the gunshot then, not at the mouth of the view screen's alley, but the narrow space in which he stood. It shouted from behind him, the muzzle blast tinging his shadow with fire. At the same moment, the view screen shattered with the bullet's impact. The other alley, with its Deckard corpse and blood-handed Kowalski, broke into darkness and shards of whirling glass. He flinched, turning his shoulder against the razor-edged storm, shielding his face with his upraised hands as the fragments bit at his wrists. In a few seconds, the shards had finished tumbling to the ground with the quick, high-pitched notes of breaking ice. Deckard lowered his hands. In front of him was the metal frame of the view screen, bent and twisted by the bullet's explosion. Scattered around it were the cables and debris of the workings, now reduced to dull, unrecognizable scraps of silicon and unlit phosphors. The world that had been contained in the screen was gone, replaced by the one in which Deckard stood, the simulation of an alley in Los Angeles. No corpse, his own or Kowalski's, lay on the rain-soaked concrete this time. He turned, knowing what he would see behind him, standing there as Rachel had stood so long ago, her coat's high collar brushing against her bound hair. Sarah Tyrell lowered the gun she held in both hands. The neon of the empty cityscape silhouetted her form. Enough light leaked past to show the coldness of her gaze, the slight lift to one corner of her mouth. "That's not right," said Deckard. "If you want to get it just the way it was. Rachel didn't smile after she shot Kowalski. It wasn't so easy for her. Sarah let the gun dangle at her side. We don't need an exact recreation. She regarded him through half-lidded eyes. Why don't we just say that we're rewriting history, changing things to the way they should have been? With the gun, she gestured down the alley's length, as if the other figures were still visible there. After all, consider how much simpler things would have been for so many people if Rachel hadn't come out and found you and saved you. Then, her gaze shifted back to him. Whatever else happened, you would have been dead before I'd ever had a chance to meet you. An undertone of regret sounded in her voice. Simpler, but I wouldn't have wanted it that way. From the front of his shirt, Deckard brushed away a few more bits of glass. Where's the girl? That was his most important business. Where did you take her? The girl? Sarah looked puzzled for a moment, then nodded. Now I remember. They left her with me. Benton and the others. They thought you wouldn't come otherwise. But that's not true, is it? She smiled knowingly. You would have come here. Just for me. That's true. The backs of Deckard's hands were spotted with blood, where the shards of the view screen had struck him. I wouldn't have missed it for anything. He watched the red drop fall from the tip of his little finger, then looked back up at Sarah. But I just want to know that she's safe. Where is she? Oh, she's safe enough. Sarah looked unconcerned. As safe as anything can be in this world. She raised the gun, bringing it up at the end of her straightened arm. You should be more worried about yourself. The black muzzle pointed directly at him. You're the one who's not quite safe. He didn't bother taking the unloaded gun from inside his jacket. He knew she couldn't be bluffed by it. Instead, Deckard looked up at the video cameras mounted in the rigging overhead. What about all those? Some of the lenses were focused on him, others on Sarah, with a few drawn back to take in the whole scene. You must have cut some kind of deal with Benton to provide him with the kind of footage he likes. He pointed to the gun leveled at himself. Is this going to do it? You're good, Deckard. She nodded in appreciation. The fur of her coat's collar was spiked with raindrops, like miniature jewels. That's the cop in you, always analyzing the situation. The gun lowered in her hand. You're right, though. They wanted more. Benton and the rest of them. They set this all up. She gestured toward the lights and the tracking video cameras. Just for the two of us. There's just some things that special effects and computer-generated images can't really do. A shrug. No substitute for live action, is there? Deckard shook his head. No, there isn't. Or death either. It's so unsatisfying when that's fate. It's like, what was it the replicant said to you? I read it in the script. Like an itch you can never scratch. Sarah smiled at him. That's why I'm so glad you could make it here, Deckard. We've been through so much together. It would be a shame not to do it right when we're just about at the end. Oh, I agree. He wondered how he was going to get the gun away from her. If she had been crazy before, she was worse now. But not stupid. Sarah had carefully kept enough distance between them so that he didn't have a chance of suddenly lunging toward her, grabbing her arm and twisting it behind her until she dropped the weapon. She'd drill him before he got halfway to her, and he'd land at her feet with the back of his skull at the closed end of the alley. Maybe we should go somewhere and talk about it. We'll talk all right, but not just now. Sarah turned away from him. then coyly glanced over her shoulder. "I think you'll know where to find me." He watched her walking away out into the empty street, the pools of rain reflecting her image like polished obsidian. A bank of video cameras watched as well, the glistening lenses turning on their pivot mounts to follow her until she had disappeared from view. I guess he was right. Even before Deckard got to the entryway of the set's replica of the Bradbury building, he saw the footprints shining wetly in the protected space between the ornate columns. Small, a woman's, with no attempt having been made to erase them. It had to be Sarah. No one else was aboard the station, outer Hollywood having been vacated by the watchers of his progress. He supposed that Urbenton was safely tucked inside some transport in the same orbit, viewing at long distance the results of his production arrangements, as Deckard had sloshed from one rainy zone of the LA set to the next. The certainty of being isolated in this small world had increased, as though the city itself had been emptied of every face except his own. Behind him, the artificial rains lashed the streets, the marquee of the $1 Million Theater shedding its plastic letters one by one, the winds spelling out some obscure noun in the pooling waters. Deckard pushed the creaking door into a cathedral-like dark, then stepped after it. The cameras focused on his back went dead, like birds in winter, as the ones inside the building were roused by his presence. Shafts of clouded light swerved through the elaborate set's interior as he gripped the stair rail and looked upward. No UN blimp moved outside. There wouldn't have been clearance for even a simulation beneath the rigging's pipes and struts, but a carefully synchronized array of lights achieved the same effect. It's not even real, thought Deckard, as Sebastian's world. In that little pocket universe, at least, there had been something like a sky and a distance between one point and any other. There would have been miles for the genetic engineer turned deity to have traveled before he found his heart's desire. But here, in this false LA, everything had been compressed and squeezed down to its essentials, the way the insane obliterated all but the pieces of their obsessions. As Deckard mounted the steps, cold wrought iron sliding under his palm, he wondered if it was his head, or Sarah's, that he had entered, the thin trails of light revealing the wreckage of her hopes or his own. At the end of the encircling corridor, with the rain trickling down through the rafters and decaying plaster above him, with the unlit empty space traversed by the elevator's elongated vertical cage to one side, Deckard pushed open the door, the same door that he had opened in the past, in memory, in a real LA, and in dreams and a pocket universe. It swung away from his hand, revealing the high-ceilinged room beyond. He almost expected the same things to happen as the first time. The two sawn-off friends of Sebastian's, the animated teddy bear and the spike-helmeted toy soldier, to march out and greet him. Instead, Deckard saw the Rachel child sitting at the massive claw-footed table, her legs dangling at the front of the chair, its carved dark oak back extending above her head. She didn't notice him when he first stepped inside the room, the braid of her dark hair draped over her shoulder as she bent her head over the sepia-toned illustrations in a Victorian gardener's manual. Between the pages, a single rose had been pressed. She lifted the brown, ancient flower to her nose, trying to catch whatever scent still remained. That was when she spotted Deckard silently watching her. "You're here," the Rachel child spoke calmly, flipping her ribbon-tied braid behind her back. She carefully laid the papery rose inside the book and closed the stiff leather covers. "I knew you would be, eventually." "Are you all right?" Cautiously, Deckard scanned the room as he stepped forward. It looked as it had when he'd been in Sebastian's private world, dusty and stuffed with wind-up dolls and mannequins. The laughing clown figure towered over one end of the table, its manic smile frozen on the stark white face. "Did anything happen to you?" "I'm fine," announced the girl. "Well, I'm bored. This is a stupid place. Everything's broken, or it doesn't work." She poked the bride doll standing next to her chair. The organza veil fluttered as the doll fell over, its arms and delicately poised hands sticking up in the air. "But those people, the ones who brought me here, they didn't hurt me or anything. They were nice enough, I suppose." "All right." Deckard barely listened to what the girl said. The crash of the bride doll had echoed through the room, stirring the white powdery plaster that had settled on the toys and overstuffed furniture. As the dust settled, he tried to hear anything else moving nearby. Lenses glinted as the video cameras, more carefully hidden in this set than outside, swiveled silently on their mounts, tracking the slow turn of his head. "Is there anybody else here with you?" He glanced at the child from the corner of his eye. "Anyone at all?" "That woman," the Rachel child laid her hands flat on the book. "You know, the one that looks like me? The one you call Sarah?" An annoyed expression crossed the girl's face. "The one who didn't think I was real? She's here." "Where?" "Up there." She gave a single nod to indicate the room's ceiling and what lay above. "That's what she told me. She'd just gotten back here a little while ago. She'd been out in the rain and stuff. Like you, see?" The girl pointed to one of the other chairs, where Sarah's high-collared coat had been tossed across the scrolled arms. The floor beneath was spotted with raindrops, shed by the fur. "She said she was going up there to wait for you." "I bet." Deckard realized he was being a fool. He knew what he should do. He should just gather up the Rachel child and lead her out of the building and off the Fall LA set entirely. The skiff was waiting at the station's loading dock, and it could carry both him and the little girl away from here. What was the point in going up and confronting Sarah with her loaded gun and equally lethal madness? She was primed to blow him away, only delaying the moment for the perfect camera opportunity. Up on the building's roof, the set that had been put together by Urbenton's techs, the detailed reproduction of the one in LA. The two of them would again be under the multi-lensed eye of the video cameras and lights in the overhead rigging. Much better, cinematically, than the relatively constricted setup here in the rooms beneath. "That must have been part of the agreement," thought Deckard, "to get me out where the best camera angles are." Completing the arc, a nice sense of structure on the director's part. To die where he hadn't died before, where he'd been saved from dying by the replicant with Roy Batty's face. "I'll just bet she wants me to go up there." "That's what she said." The Rachel child gave a shrug and a sharp-eyed gaze at Deckard. "You don't have to do it if you don't want to." The little girl was eerily smart, for reasons that Deckard knew something of. Back in the Martian emigrant colony, Marley had told him about the child's lonely, eccentric growing up aboard the scuttled Salander 3, and more than that. But she was wrong now. He did have to do it, to go and meet Sarah on the rain-swept roof beneath the watching cameras. "We could never get away," he said to the girl sitting at the table. "There'd be no place we could go that I could take you to. Not Earth, not Mars, not anywhere. No place that she wouldn't find us. So I just have to do it eventually and get it over with. Here or there, now or some other time. But it has to happen." "I don't know about any of that." The Rachel child looked guilelessly at him. "That's not any of my business, but you have to do what you think is best." "All right," Deckard nodded slowly. "That's just what I'll do." He took the gun out of his jacket and laid it on the table. "This isn't any good. It's not loaded, so forget about it. I just don't want to carry it around with me anymore. If anything happens, if I don't come back down, or if Sarah comes down without me, or if those other people come here," he shrugged, "there's not really anything you can do, and you shouldn't have to." "Should I go hide, if that's what happens?" Deckard smiled at the girl. "Where do you think you'd go?" "I don't know." The Rachel child gave another shrug. "Somewhere. There's a whole city out there." She pointed to one of the arched windows. "With people and stuff. I could find some place where nobody would know where to look for me." He glanced over his shoulder at the window, with the artificial rain beating against the glass, the gauzy curtains stirred by the drafts that had penetrated the meticulously constructed decay of the interior set. "She believes it's real," thought Deckard. The ones who had brought her here, or Benton and the others, had let the child go on with the notions that they had left her in the middle of a real city, the real Los Angeles. He didn't know if that had been cruel or kind on their parts, or whether it made any difference. The way the girl had been brought up by the autonomic machinery of the Salander 3. The city outside these windows, such as it was, probably seemed as real as any other could have. "No," said Deckard, "that's not a good idea. Don't try to hide. I don't think they'll hurt you. If I don't come back, then just let them take you to where they want to. Maybe they'll take you back home. You know, where you came from. You could stay there a long time and you'd be all right." "But I don't want to." A tear had welled up and trembled at the Rachel child's dark lashes. "I don't want to go there. I'd rather stay with you." The high back chair toppled over with a crash as the girl pushed herself away from the table. She ran to him and hugged him around the waist, the side of her face against his jacket. "I'm going with you." "No, you're not. You can't." The same protective, almost paternal feeling as before passed silently through Deckard's thoughts. The girl looked so much like Rachel, the woman he'd loved. She could have been their daughter, a child that could never have happened. Not here, he mused. Maybe out there in the stars. Perhaps Rachel would have been one of those that changed, became human. They could have had a life together. Too late for that, he knew. Now there were only the bits and pieces of his own life to pick up and sort out, make something of, something other than killing. That was why he'd quit being a Blade Runner a long time ago. But that hadn't been enough. That was why he'd agreed to take on the other job presented to him. The business of delivering the briefcase with Batty's voice and Isidore's list inside it. Too late for that as well. Whether it had been salvation or death for the insurgent replicants, it didn't matter now. The only things left to him were the little girl and what Marley had told him about her, about who she really was, and the slim proof, not even that, evidence that had to be taken on faith as to what it meant, that Marley, 2 minutes away from death, had given him. Deckard touched the front of his jacket, a finger's width away from where he had been carrying the empty gun, and felt the thin, stiff rectangle of the ancient photograph, the one that had been hidden in the Salander 3's first aid kit. That was all he had with which to confront Sarah. One way or another, it would be enough. Look, with difficulty, he managed to push the child away from him. You stay down here, and everything will be all right, I promise. He wondered for a moment why she had formed such a sudden, dramatic attachment to him. There's no one else, thought Deckard. The child was all alone in this universe, or in any other. Plus, it was impossible to tell. She might have sensed the fragments of his past, the memories of someone else named Rachel that the girl's dark eyes and grave manner conjured up so painfully in him. Even if she didn't understand yet how those things had come to be, maybe she just felt sorry for him. All right, Deckard put his hands on her shoulders and leaned down to look straight into her eyes. The glimpse of them ran through his own heart like a dagger of silver and ice. The bad things have already happened, he told the girl. Nothing else can go wrong. He lied. So don't worry about me. He left her sitting at the table again, surrounded by the mutely uncomforting dolls. The Rachel child folded her arms across the thick, leather-bound book and laid her head down, concealing her face from him. Deckard stepped out to the open corridor beyond and quietly pulled the door shut behind himself.